Hello and welcome to the Sunday News Register Sunday Sit Down. I'm John McCabe. Here in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania today to talk about two words that have become rather common around the household these days, Marcellus Shale. Joining us is Ms. Kathryn Klaber, who is the Executive Director of the Marcellus Shale Coalition. Ms. Klaber, thank you for taking some time to join us.
My pleasure.
As I said, Marcellus Shale has become a word, particularly over the past year, that everyone has come to learn. The formation is said to hold up to possibly up to 50 trillion cubic feet of recoverable natural gas, maybe more.
Yeah.
And gas companies right now are very interested in finding those pockets of gas and extracting it. What does the gas find mean to, maybe specifically to the northern panhandle of West Virginia, but also to this entire tri-state region?
Right. Well, you're right to point out that Marcellus Shale has become a more household word, and as soon as that's happened, it's probably not as important to just be talking about the Marcellus. The Utica Shale, for example, is a deeper formation that also holds a tremendous amount and has a footprint that's even larger than the 95,000 square miles of the Marcellus. But the panhandle of West Virginia and where we're sitting right now is really very much in the center of all that gas and the ability to tap gas to break up the very tight shale rock and liberate that natural gas has really changed how we're looking at, as a country, our energy prospects and what are the opportunities that come to us from a competitiveness standpoint, from a energy security and the associated geopolitical ramifications of that. And here we are right in the middle of it, where we can have the benefit both of using that gas locally without the transportation charges to bring it from the Rocky Mountain West or from the Gulf, being able to have lower priced energy for businesses and homes, and also the associated economic and the responsibilities that come with developing it locally.
And maybe you don't have an exact number for this, but around a ballpark figure, what is the total amount so far that has been invested into Marcellus Shale through leasing, development, royalties in some areas that are already being paid?
Right. Well, we've done some analyses over the last few years and are working on a third update right now. But a couple numbers that can start to put it into context. In 2008 alone, just in Pennsylvania, and obviously there's a lot of additional development in eastern Ohio and in West Virginia, and has been for years, but just in the Marcellus and Pennsylvania alone, $1.8 billion went to local landowners. Another, I think, important indicator of this, did a calculation of how many publicly announced investments have been done over the last several years in Pennsylvania. In the broader region, and we were at $22 billion, 17.9 of that last year in 2010 alone. Those are dollars beyond the investments that are being done day in and day out. Those are new investments by both national and also international companies investing in what is seen to be tremendous opportunities economically from what's being done on the ground here.
Okay, you're just speaking of the investment in the Marcellus Shale development. Another aspect of this that has really been started to gain momentum in our area, or at least a lot of talk, has been with number one, the natural gas liquid processing facilities, and beyond that, number two, an ethane cracker facility. Bayer Corporation has been looking at possibly bringing a cracker facility down by their New Martinsville plant to kind of work with what they're already doing there. What, in your opinion, or maybe what do you see over the next decade in terms of what the landscape in our area is going to look like because of the Marcellus Shale development?
Well, the Bayer project is a very, very exciting, and with the asset base of the New Martinsville facility, the safety programs there, the workforce that's in place, it makes for a good place to put additional manufacturing around ethane, which is a byproduct of the gas development, essentially another product in the wet gas region. It's one of probably almost a dozen projects that have been announced. They won't all necessarily happen, but at least a couple of them will. And I think what it speaks to is methane is good for heating our homes, cooking our food that we know of, but we don't typically think about all the other uses as a raw material in manufacturing, like what Bayer uses it for, as a transportation fuel. Lots of different ways that natural gas is used that affect businesses, all around the region that we're sitting in. So when you're using as a business natural gas to heat your plant, to fire your equipment, to fire your fuel burning equipment, when that is sustainably, or when we look forward and see a large amount of supply from both the Marcellus and all the other shale plays under development right now in the U.S., we can predict that those are going to be more stable costs for natural gas than they have been, and all sorts of business decisions could be made then, with assuming this is going to be a resource available for a long time.
Sticking with the wet gas byproducts, we've been told that Ohio and Marshall counties in West Virginia are particularly rich in wet gas. What number one, I guess, what does that mean for the average landowner or resident of our area? And two, what does it mean in terms of production, maybe even more interest in drilling than otherwise would take place? So,
the choices to drill, to develop a leasehold, there's a lot of factors that come into that. The amount of years left on the lease, the local conditions around which you're able to drill, but obviously commodity price is probably one of the most important. And so whereas development will still be occurring on the methane-rich areas, where essentially what you're getting out of the ground is CH4 ready to go to burner tip, you're seeing, with relatively higher prices of oil than gas, additional interest in those wet gas areas. And if you think of about 75%, maybe typically is the amount of methane in a wet gas area, 25% are these other liquids. Each one of those other liquids has a market, has a value, whether it be propane that will go to also heating and other industrial uses. We talked about the ethane that Bayer and others are interested in. But all those products, have value and can create a value chain and the associated manufacturing jobs, other supply chain jobs that come along with them. And getting it here, as opposed to having to ship it in from somewhere else, presents obvious advantages.
With that, I mean, if the Bayer project would not come to fruition, is it likely that someone else might try it, given the proximity to that product right away, or maybe that's not the best way to phrase it, but do you see a good market for a cracker facility, for example?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the appetite for that. It's, Bayer is a very strong candidate to do that here, but obviously there's other projects on the, that have been announced. Nova taking the ethane through Buckeye Pipeline Project up to Sarnia, taking that ethane east to Sunoco, or maybe shipping it down to the Gulf. But I think we'd all like to see something additional local. There's a lot going on locally, but being able to use that ethane locally certainly makes a lot of sense. But even if, beyond just the ethane, the presence of natural gas as a feedstock, as a raw material, has manufacturing benefits and can result in a chemical industry rebirth that goes, well beyond just a single cracker.
Okay. You mentioned oil just a minute ago, and hear a lot about how horizontal drilling and in the case of natural gas and fracturing, hydraulic fracturing, allows for gas to be extracted from the Marcellus Shale. Has there been any studies or any talk about how horizontal drilling could help in reaching oil pockets? Maybe in the Panhandle there are some counties that have been rich in oil, some previously inaccessible oil pockets that now could be reached through horizontal drilling?
Well, when you mention pockets, that's probably not the way to think about how hydraulic fracturing helps us get to oil and gas. It's more the very, very tiny kind of spaces, pore spaces in which the hydrocarbons are trapped that hydraulic fracturing helps you get to. Hydraulic fracturing has been used across the country for oil and gas development for decades now, and is very much a part of oil and gas development around the country. As it is here, to be able to see those kind of hydrocarbons being able to be accessed along with the natural gas that's trapped in those very, very tiny parts of a big shale deposits, and using that hydraulic fracturing technology to break apart that tight shale and release whether it be oil or gas.
Yeah, we have noticed some wells do produce both oil and gas. Is that something? I mean, is oil? I guess more of my question of is oil something? Can oil production be increased as particularly as oil prices continue to rise? Does it become more feasible through fracturing and horizontal drilling?
Yeah, I mean, just about many of my members are looking across their entire portfolio, whether it be in North Dakota, whether it be in the oil sands in Canada, whether it be down in the Eagleford Shale in South Texas that is that's a hydrocarbon-rich deposit. So every company is making their own decisions as to where their assets are, how much oil versus gas that they choose to develop based on their capital deployment plan, and as you pointed out, the relative price of natural gas versus oil.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about drilling. I've had a former state regulator tell us that the measurement of gas at the wellhead is, in his words, quote, very suspect. Once a property owner would sign a mineral rights lease and drilling and then production ensues, what controls are in place to ensure that that property owner's rights are protected?
Well, and that's an issue that I'm sure you can find many better experts on than me. But there are audit procedures in place. It's something that the financial community needs to know what kind of gas is being produced for lots of reasons. A major one of which is what's the appropriate division of that production value to the mineral lease owner and to the lessor, the company who's doing that. So there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of audit that's in place on this, a lot of measurements, some of which are unique to one well, some of which need to be allocated back to a series of wells. But that is something that obviously our member companies and their financial, the financial personnel within those companies and who oversee their work from an audit perspective, I'll take very, very seriously.
You don't see any reason for people to be concerned, though, that they're, maybe cheated is maybe not a good word, but that they should have full faith that their production numbers are correct?
Well, I think it's important on a lot of different issues, including this one, that when someone's signing a lease, that they have an attorney review not just all the other contents, but make sure to understand how that production value is going to be determined, and then be fully informed as to how that's being done over time. I think that's in the best interest of both the oil and gas companies, obviously, as well as the homeowner.
Okay. Another issue that surfaces with drilling is when the mineral rights are owned by a person who doesn't own the surface rights.
Split estates.
Exactly. Okay, that's a good word. How does the industry weigh the protections that the surface owner does need to be afforded? Obviously, there are state regulations in place as to how close you can drill to a home, etc. But how does the industry deal with that issue? Surface rights owner or surface owner's rights versus the mineral owner.
Right. Well, I mean, it's not unusual to have those split estates in parts of the country. Those, the mineral rights may have been separated from the surface rights years ago, and we have that situation here as well. You wouldn't treat a surface owner who's not the mineral rights owner any different from an environmental protection standpoint, from a working within the many laws and regulations that govern where a well can be sited and how it can be or how it needs to be permitted. I've heard of anecdotally a lot of situations where the company who may be drilling on a property that does not have own the mineral rights will really look to how to be a good neighbor with that company or with that individual, because that's acknowledged to be an area where you want to make sure that that relationship is strong as it can be. One thing though that is important to realize with the horizontal drilling is there's a very small fraction of the total area being drilled relative to where that well site is. So you can have lots of surface owners that are separate from the mineral rights owners who will never see the well because it's going horizontally, under their property. And I think that's something, that helps when there's split estates, when the drilling is happening, underneath, but not on the surface of those split estates.
Kind of a follow-up to that question. We are in a very coal-rich region, long history of coal mining in our area. And obviously a lot of the mistrust for industry comes from things that happened 100 years ago, and whatnot. But how well do you believe the industry has done in cases such as when you have a split estate of working with, being a little more public relations savvy, being a good community neighbor, as opposed to just doing it and saying, well, this is our right to do it, we have a contract,
right,
and to heck with it.
Well, I would say the industry is really sensitive to this legacy issue, and it's not just about coal. It could be about timber in parts of the state. It could be in general about the mistrust of any activity that went on, especially prior to some sweeping regulations that came through this country in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So, to say that that's not front of mind would not be reflecting what goes on in our organization's conversation. So, being sensitive to the legacy that we are following of not so good relations in a lot of places, and some legacies that we can still see around us today, and that does put extra pressure and extra sensitivities that you're seeing in how some of these stories are being manifest. Nobody wants to repeat the past mistakes under their watch. I think that the state regulatory agencies are feeling that pressure and are executing their mission accordingly. I think that the industry is probably doing more from a transparency and disclosure standpoint than any industry has had to do in the past. How much data is available online? How much is being shared publicly that even 5 to 10 years ago wouldn't have been shared publicly? That makes for some rocky times in the short term when there's all this data out there and some people are interpreting it that really don't have the understanding of the industry. But in short order, we believe that transparency will translate into a greater level of trust, and we're only as good as how we earned that trust yesterday or with each landowner that you're referring to. It's not going to be perfect, but that is clearly a principle that we're operating under, which is how do we interact with these communities and how do we leave a legacy behind that will change will upset the assumptions that industry is just here to make a buck and move on. That is not what's driving.
It does seem that you have your work cut out for you there. I mean, yeah, you do have some, it's in our area right now. It's not too bad. You do have some very outspoken residents and folks, but in Pennsylvania, where we're at now, I mean, up in Dimmock and or Dymock and different areas where there's just a lot of division. Associated Press, did you see the story they put out over the divided towns? Do you feel that, and you kind of touched on it, but do you feel that your work will pay benefits in those towns? And
yeah, I was up in Dimmock and Susquehanna County a few weeks ago, and I think the work that's being done on the ground is different than what you see reported by a reporter sitting at their desk in New York City. That's where there tends to be, in my personal view, these preconceived notions that come from the legacy problems that are just put right back out onto the page. But when I was there, you're seeing hotel owners who are, thrilled with the opportunities they've had to work with the industry, and the people who, come to that restaurant every night who live in the town. You're seeing the supply chain grow in ways that people in these communities never would have imagined that they would have this economic opportunity. And there are still going to be problems neighbor to neighbor, and I don't think human nature will ever get us beyond that. But what is missed, I think, in so much of this coverage and concern is that since this legacy, some of these legacies were created, we have, as citizens of this country, asked our elected officials to put sweeping laws and regulations in place. Those are in place now and weren't the last time around. Obviously we have to enforce those laws and be accountable for every piece of what we are being held accountable to do. But to think that somehow it's an unregulated industry at this point is missing the fact that there are literally dozens of regulations that apply to every step of this process.
You mentioned New York. There's been almost near hysteria there over fracking, or that's how it seems, at least. That's how it's been portrayed. It's led to a moratorium on drilling in New York State right now. Do you have any concerns that might sweep from New York down into Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, as far as just the concerns and the fears that the residents in New York have been airing?
Well, and when you say the residents, I think a lot of that fear is coming from from the urban centers. No, I'm not concerned that it's going to sweep down. If it would have done it by now. When you look at the fact that 1,415 wells were drilled in Pennsylvania last year alone, just many of those just south of the border, done so safely, done so under a regulatory schema with an incredible supply chain of local companies involved with that, with landowners that are happy to be benefiting. I think what you are starting to see in the southern tier of New York is landowners mineral rights owners who cannot believe that they are continuing to be denied participation in this overall development. So no, I don't think it's going to sweep. What they're doing there clearly is trying to get through a process taking a lot longer than any regulatory agency should take to get through a process. I mean, you should be processing this to get to a point where there's a conclusion, and that conclusion might be yes or no, but a limbo, I think everybody deserves more certainty than what we're seeing in a place like New York. And remember, all through that moratorium, people in New York are using low emissions, clean burning, reasonably priced natural gas to heat their homes, to run their businesses, to cook their food. So, I see a little bit of a concern there that there's not a broad-based understanding that to do this, we need to do this.
Okay, let's talk a little more about environmental concerns. Over the last year, we've had several explosions in our area at different drilling sites, led to injuries, sites being shut down, violations. Do you know what the industry average is for accidents during the drilling and extraction process?
Well, I don't have those numbers absolutely current, but I did look at labor and industry data a few months ago, and this was in, I believe this was just Pennsylvania data, although it may have been national. But when I looked at oil and gas, the number of injuries were actually lower than the equivalent in the category that was museums, zoos, and I forget what the third area was grouped into that category. But no injury, no incident is acceptable or is a good thing. And so the goal there, even if it was one, would be to reduce that. And we have a safety committee at the coalition that's doing a tremendous amount of work on best practices around who's operating at a site, what kind of pre-qualifications do they have in terms of safety training, first responder training. We've now certified over 2,400 first responders in a pretty basic training, but one that needs to be rolled out across, as you can imagine, hundreds of communities to be sure that those local fire departments know what they're finding if they would have to respond to an incident. And it's a matter of being prepared for for a rare incident, but ones that we know have occurred, and having the people who are in those roles to respond know what they're finding and being able to respond accordingly.
Okay, this is a little bit of a long question, so I'll do my best to get it out quickly. Fracking continues to come under fire, maybe not right, but it continues to be scrutinized, even in Congress. This week, as we taped, you had a deputy U.S. EPA administrator inform the U.S. Senate committee. He said, and quote, "We believe that this important resource, being natural gas, can be and must be extracted responsibly." And then went on to say that the gas extraction process can contaminate water supplies unless properly managed. Cornell University has a study that's nearly ready to. It's got some excerpts out that claiming that methane leaks during the extraction process actually makes natural gas a worse emitter of greenhouse gases than coal. And then you've got Bob Casey continues to push the Frack Act, Senator Casey here in Pennsylvania. How does the industry, this kind of ties in what we talked about a little bit earlier, but how does the industry continue to respond to these concerns that have been raised?
Well, there are some of those that are legitimate concerns. We need to do process improvement, continue to get better. There are some, like Cornell's study about greenhouse gas emissions, that is just blatantly irresponsible academics. And I'll address those two things separately because I think they are in very different camps. The issue around hydraulic fracturing, I think it's, that word has gotten some broad connotation about natural resource extraction in general, not the fact that it's just one phase of a very sophisticated, high technology way of bringing fuel and energy to Americans. The concerns around hydraulic fracturing have been all over the board, and I'll tell you, there are ones that are legitimate and there are ones that are not well founded. The fact that hydraulic fracturing over a mile below the surface can somehow cause vertical migration of hydraulic fracturing fluids and methane up through a mile of geology has never been shown. It's never been confirmed. And when you look at some of the data that I've seen from the companies, you cannot picture being able to have that process down below migrate up through the earth to a drinking water supply that might even be 1,000 feet deep. So that's important to recognize. What's going down beneath the surface is being managed well. It's being done appropriately. The casing around the wells is a very important part of that. How do we build these wells to keep what's inside, and to keep what's in the surrounding geology outside? And that's where we've had some upgrades on regulations, not just in this part of the country, but around the state, to make sure that that we're doing that well. Where we have to be ever vigilant is at the surface. How do you avoid this fluid, at the well site, having a spill, having some kind of contamination that would occur because of bad housekeeping? That's where the erosion sedimentation plans, how we build the sites, how protective they are to keep anything that's on the well pad on the well pad. So that's what I think is important as we look through any violations that have been, levied, that they are about surface management, not about what's going on a mile below the surface. And that's important to understand around hydraulic fracturing. The issue of greenhouse gas emissions, that study, we could spend an hour going over the problems with that study, but suffice it to say that there was an ignoring of the cleanliness of this fuel when it's burned. That was totally not part of the calculation. And if we're talking life cycle in every other forum, why wouldn't we be talking life cycle in this forum? Number two, the researchers chose to ignore factors that have been approved by the IPCC, by other entities that are relied upon as the best science, and why one university somehow has better science, and only changed those factors for natural gas, didn't change it for any other fuel. Thirdly, used pipelines that are very long-haul pipelines overseas and in parts of this country that have nothing to do with the what we're seeing here in the Marcellus, which is if you're developing this gas locally, you have to take it less distances, and then made a major misappropriation by saying that any gas lost over that long period of time went to the atmosphere, when in fact that gas is lost for other things like fuel to propel that gas along that long distances. I could go on, but that is an example that even the researchers themselves are on tape saying that this data is pretty, on which the study was based, is pretty shaky. And I think it is a disservice to not just the American people, but when stories like that then get picked up overseas and have been based on calculations that would not hold up under any reasonable peer review, and that are very easy to look at and say, you've got to be kidding me. So that's my view on that greenhouse gas story.
Okay, I think that was pretty good. As a follow-up to that last question, your member list reads like a who's who of energy producers, not only in America but across the world. Given that, how do what needs to be done to make sure that to get the public to understand that your message is not just the industry promoting itself? What do you need to do to make sure that your credibility can stand up?
That is a really, really good question. Our full members are, as you indicated, the majority of the E&P companies in this part of the country, as well as a growing number of midstream companies, those who are building the gathering lines to get the gas from the wellhead to the companies that would just distribute it to our homes and businesses. Those companies have a lot at stake, not just financially, but their global reputation is very much riding on how well they do the job here in Appalachia. But as you pointed out, that can't be where the story ends, or it is just a self-promotion. That's why the leadership of the coalition made a decision over a year ago to have another set of businesses be part of our organization. We call them our associate members, and they can range from large multinational corporations themselves that are selling safety equipment or steel pipe and tube or other materials into our market, but who also have a vested interest both from a business standpoint and who are regionally based. You mentioned Bayer earlier. Having Bayer have a big stake in this industry is very important to show a broader interest in what this means for energy security, what it means for the regional economy, and frankly, what it means for clean air. In all these studies that have been done, it's amazing that no independent has come out yet, and I would hope they would soon, showing that by just switching some of our vehicle for transportation fuel over to natural gas, as well as continuing the increase of electricity generation by natural gas, can pretty much allow us to meet our national ambient air quality standards for particulate matter, for nitrogen oxides, and other criteria pollutants, just by that burning. So, I think that this industry will continue to need a lot of stakeholders, not just from other businesses, but from academia, from regional chambers of commerce, from the stakeholders in the environmental community that understand the footprint of this gas production is a lot smaller than a lot of other alternatives out there right now, and that the agricultural community, the sportsmen's groups who can see partnerships in this industry having their groups better off tomorrow than they were, yesterday if we all do it right together.
Okay, maybe as the last question because we're running short on time. One of the maybe biggest complaints that we hear deal with jobs. A lot of the jobs that are created in the industry are folks coming from Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma to work on the rigs to handle that work because they're trained, they're experienced in it. What needs to be done to get more jobs local throughout this region with the drilling process, with the gas extraction process?
Well, if you look in northern West Virginia, where we are here in Cannonsburg, up on in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, in Youngstown, Ohio, with the brand new steel plant and all the supply chain around there, I think it becomes pretty clear that a handful of jobs on a rig doth not make the workforce around this industry. Those are very, very important jobs, and by their nature, they will be transient. Whether it's transient from Morgantown to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to Indiana, PA, Indiana, PA to Youngstown, Youngstown to Williamsport. I mean, as you are developing a natural resource, those jobs are moving with that rig, and it can be a Texas-based team that picks up a couple Pennsylvanians or West Virginians or Ohioans along the way, and that's all good. But that is such a tiny percentage of the overall jobs. Our associate members, if you would look through the jobs that they have available, our full members and associate members on our jobs portal, where they link directly to the open jobs that are waiting to be filled in this industry in this part of the country. You'll see hundreds of jobs, and they range from accountants, HR managers, land agents. Just looking outside the window here, there are 2 buildings that are being built right now, construction firms, the building management for those offices. It goes on and on throughout the types of jobs, and a handful of folks running the rig. Sure, more of those being local would be great, and we're continuing to go in that direction because it's a lot more economical to have folks go home to their house an hour or 2 hours away than it is a plane flight away. But for us to limit our scope of where those jobs are coming from to just the rig, I think is missing incredibly broad.
Why do you think it is? Because that is where so much of the focus is essentially on the rig workers. Is that what causes that to be such the focus? Is it because it's the more visible part of the job?
Well, it's interesting. I've been on a lot of well tours, and when you go on a well tour, you don't necessarily go talk to who's providing the catering, to the group that day, or you don't necessarily go back and find out who did what local company did the site preparation or did the surveying work. What you're seeing on that well tour is the single person sitting in the control booth, and that person, by their very job title, is transient. I mean, they move with that multi-million-dollar rig. That is what I've seen personally. And meanwhile, you've got a dozen contractors right on that site who, the vast majority of them are local contractors. The vast majority of truck drivers that enter and leave the site every day are working locally. You don't bring people in from Texas and Oklahoma to drive that truck. So I do think there's an incredibly disproportionate focus on just who's running that drilling rig that day. But I have the pleasure of seeing those, hundreds of people just within our coalition alone on a weekly basis who are either natives of Pennsylvania or who have come to West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio to raise their families. And folks right here in this office, a lot of them have boomeranged back because they're the ones that want to come back and be part of the communities, raise their family where they grew up, and there's growing jobs here to do that.